Good evening. Are y'all warm now? Are you ready for winter to be over? Are you ready to go to Florida? Well, thank you for coming tonight. I'm John Perrell, Director of the Friends of Smithsonian. I want to also welcome the people who are watching on the web. This is our first simulcast on the web for one of our lectures. So we're able to reach members across the nation and across the globe. I actually hear there's a bunch of people from Miami on watching tonight, so hello, Miami. We're very proud that we can bring the Smithsonian to you in different ways. By presenting experts such as Dr. Peter Marra to you in person as well as virtually in your home, office, or wherever you are. It's amazing that people around the world can now easily search our vast collections, libraries, and archives. You can learn how we preserve America's historical treasures. You can see Bao Bao playing in the snow for the first time. You can study amazing artifacts in 3D. You can discover something new about Krispy Kreme donuts or Tabasco sauce. Or you can catch up on the latest research on what we think humans will be doing on other planets someday. All this information about our country's past, present, and future is extraordinary, endless, and astonishingly at your fingertips. Our members often say to me that they really enjoy the ability to gather together to learn as part of their membership with the Friends of Smithsonian, which is a great thing. Museums across the nation are kind of communities. So the ability for us to be able to bring this to you in person and as well now online is a great thing that we can bring to you. And it's because of you, because of your support, we're able to do this. So your generosity and your partnership really helps us reach broader audiences and lifelong learners. And tonight I want to introduce you to Dennis Kelly. Dennis has been with the National Zoo since 2010, and he has a huge job. He oversees 450 staff members, 2,000 animals, 3,300 acres of zoo, conservation, education, and research space. That's pretty incredible. After serving in the military, he has worked with different companies such as Procter & Gamble and Coca-Cola, and most recently spent 6 years as the president of Zoo Atlanta. So without any further ado, thank you for joining us tonight, Dennis.
You know, the Smithsonian was founded on the idea of increase and diffusion of knowledge. And under our secretary, Dr. Clough, we embarked on 4 grand challenges. And the grand challenge that the zoo and the Conservation Biology Institute fit in so closely is to understand and maintain biodiversity on our planet. And that active verb, maintain, is a first for the Smithsonian, is that we are in the business of not only understanding biodiversity, but maintaining it. And that is why the zoo was founded by the Smithsonian 125 years ago. And why the bison were brought back. The last few bison were actually brought to the mall, and that was the first animal that the zoo cared for, because there was a realization by the Smithsonian, by the secretary, by the Congress, that we were beginning to see species go extinct at a rate that was unparalleled. And in fact, we know that we are now in the midst of the Anthropocene and the 6th great extinction on our planet. Your zoo has always been, as part of its mission, research, and now and for the last 40 years has been actively involved in preserving species from extinction. And we're proud that we are doing research and taking active steps, not only with species like giant panda and Bao Bao, not only with like a Sumatran tiger and other species, and not only in the fact that we're working in 25 countries around the world, but we're working across a broad array and depth of issues that are affecting us as humans in this age of the Anthropocene. So while we're in the midst of this sixth great extinction, we're dependent upon our scientists, our curators, and our biologists to help us lead this through this era to preserve biodiversity on our planet. My colleague, Dr. Steve Montfort, says, why should you care about biodiversity? Well, if you care about clean air, if you care about clean water, if you care about secure food supply, you will care about biodiversity. And our speaker tonight represents a person, a scientist, and a team that has been focused on the issues of the change in biodiversity, and it has to do with right here with what's going on in our hemisphere. Dr. Pete Marra is a scientist that's worked at the Smithsonian over 15 years. He received his PhD from Dartmouth and is now the head of the Smithsonian Migratory Birds Center. Dr. Marra is going to talk to you about what's been going on with migratory birds and the state of the birds here in the Western Hemisphere. So without any further ado, let me introduce to you Dr. Pete Marra.
Thanks, Dennis. Thanks very much. And thanks to the Friends of Smithsonian for hosting this event. And thanks to all you out there in the world that are joining us via live web broadcast for the first time. If you're in Miami, have a mojito for me, please. And thanks to all you for coming out on this cold evening. You'll be happy to know that if, from a bird's perspective, springtime is here. Just this morning, I had cardinals that were singing back and forth, and chickadees that are singing, and tufted titmice. You know, for them, it's not the temperature, it's the light. So when the light changes, their hormones start moving, and they actually start to get pretty excited and start to display on their territories and start to think about females, and females start to think about males, and things start moving. So I always get into spring mode much earlier because I'm haunted by sound. And so I can hear all these things all the time, and I sort of know what's going on around me in a very different sense than other folks do. But thanks for coming out tonight. Let's talk about birds. I thought I'd begin to talk to you about the Smithsonian Migratory Birds Center, to tell you a little bit about where I'm from and what the center actually is. We're dedicated to fostering a greater understanding, appreciation, and protection of birds and this grand phenomenon of migration. Where do we come from? Well, it was in the 1980s that a group of us, not actually a group of scientists, the royal us, discovered that there was some major declines going on with migratory birds. And they looked at something called the Breeding Bird Survey Route. It was my predecessor, Russ Greenberg, and Sam Droege, and some other folks at USGS, one individual in particular by the name of Chan Robbins, who is just a giant in the field of ornithology as far as I'm concerned. He created something called the Breeding Bird Survey Route, which allowed us to monitor populations of birds across the country. And when this group of scientists did this in the 1980s, they discovered that there were some pretty alarming declines going on with birds that we thought were just fine, because we heard them right in our neighborhoods, our backyard, and our forest plots. But it's not until you start looking at things at different spatial scales that you can start to really understand what's going on with their populations. They published this paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, and it started to hit the press. It became big news. And thanks to friends like Tom Lovejoy and others, it got up to Congress, and Congress said, we need to do something about this. We're going to create the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, which they did. And we've been around ever since. And our main mission is to do what I've just described, to sort of get people excited about migration, about migratory birds, about this grand phenomenon, about protecting these species that are oh so spectacular. And one of our main mantras is that we need to sort of get concerned about these species when they're common. The time to protect these species, or any species, is when it's common, not when it's an endangered species, not when it's threatened, because then it costs millions and millions of dollars, billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, maybe not that much. But it's still a very costly effort once something becomes threatened, or once the Endangered Species Act needs to be invoked. So the time to protect species is when they're common. Our work is proactive, it's interactive, and international in reach. We do long-term and applied research all over the Western Hemisphere, all over the globe. We train the next generation of scientists. We have a very large graduate program. We're adjunct at lots of different universities and colleges around the U.S. We have lots of postdoctoral fellows that have come through the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center that have unique opportunities to conduct some first-rate science. And we take increasing public awareness really seriously. We do this in all sorts of innovative ways, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we do. At the essence of a lot of our science and what makes us so unique is that we approach migration and migratory birds in an annual cycle context. The way most research has been done, it's really focused on breeding season biology. We take full annual cycle research because we understand that what happens on the wintering grounds in places like Haiti, Belize, Colombia, Chile, are inextricably linked with what's happening either in migration stops here in the Delaware Bay or in the Arctic tundra. All these things are linked, both by the birds and by the people. We started projects like the Migratory Connectivity Project, which is all about tracking these individual animals and connecting the people between these different places that are so far apart. Tracking things that fly, if you study birds, is essential. So we are on the cutting edge of developing new technologies, whether it's things that are small, like a 1-gram device, or using cell phones, or using airlines, like the United Airlines, to track animals across the globe. This is a golden eagle we're tracking right now in Colorado using cell phone trackers. Jays on the Channel Islands. Red knots, a species that was just threatened and has never actually been tracked remotely with a satellite transmitter. We're the first to do it, just happened a couple months ago. And things like the eastern willet, where we really never knew where they wintered, but it turns out they winter off the coast of Brazil, where shrimp farming is starting to deforest massive areas of coastline, areas really critical for so many of our shorebirds. We invented something called bird-friendly coffee, which took advantage of the fact that coffee can be grown in shade environments. Coffee can also be grown in sun environments, but when you deforest an area and put coffee in this sort of environment, it doesn't do any good for wildlife, for birds, for native mammals, for native resident species. But we actually provided science to show that you could actually grow coffee in a shade environment, and we brought this to the marketplace and we created Smithsonian bird-friendly coffee. So people in a grocery store can make a decision about what they want to do for preserving habitat by drinking Smithsonian bird-friendly coffee. This is now available in most Whole Foods around the country. You can get it at Kroger's, you can get it at Mom's, you can get it at a variety of stores, and we're starting to expand the offerings of this in a lot of different places. We study evolution. We've been studying the evolution of jays and orange-crowned warblers and song sparrows on the Channel Islands off of California. And as I mentioned, we really work hard to take our science and get it out there. So it's either influencing a child or it's influencing a policymaker. And that is our dream, to really do the science that makes a difference. That's what we want to do. We invented International Migratory Bird Day back in the early 1990s. This is now taking place every spring and every fall throughout the Western Hemisphere at over 750 venues. We do all sorts of compelling communications and outreach. Our science is published in places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and we have all sorts of really cool education programs, and I'm going to just tell you about two. One of which is Bridging the Americas, which is a program where we pair classrooms here, usually middle school classrooms, with classrooms in places like Cuba, Nicaragua, Colombia. And the kids become pen pals, and they talk about birds, and not just about the science, but they talk about birds through art, through music, through all sorts of means. They share artwork back and forth. The teachers talk back and forth and learn about innovative ways to teach their kids about birds. Our teachers go down there, their teachers come up here. They're wonderful exchange programs all about these connections through migratory birds. Neighborhood Nestwatch is another program. Urban ecology is something that we just now are starting to understand, but the fact of the matter is that almost 50% of the U.S. has been urbanized, is human-dominated, and we don't know that much about birds and other wildlife that live in these environments. So I started something called Neighborhood Nestwatch to understand this impact of urbanization on wildlife. But at the same time, you need to also study the people that live here. So we teach the people, the public, about science and the effects of urbanization by getting them involved in the science themselves. So they actually become scientists. We go there, catch birds, and we teach them how to watch these birds, collect data. We've published 30, 40 papers with these citizen scientists and the data that they've collected. This is now expanded all up and down the eastern seaboard, from Springfield, Massachusetts to Gainesville, Florida. Finally, I want to tell you a little bit about how we're taking all of this exciting science, all of this exciting outreach, these educational programs, this way that we can reach the public about birds, And we're putting it into this exciting exhibit called Experience Migration. That's happening right up here. We're renovating the entire birdhouse, and the work that we do at the Migratory Bird Center will be the hallmark of what's in this birdhouse. Everything from talking about the shorebirds, to the songbirds, to the bird-friendly coffee program, to how we track birds and how we follow them around the planet, the globe. And we're going to have a tracking station where we're going to actually be banding birds every day, or almost every day. And the public, the general public, whether they're students that are visiting or they're a school group that's coming specifically for this, will actually see us doing our work with wild birds captured in the hand, and they can let them go. It's a unique opportunity to take this species, birds, that people experience every day. I feel like birds are this everyday connection that people have to nature, because when you leave your house, you can see a robin, a song sparrow, a cardinal. You can't do that with a lot of animals. You wake up in the morning and you're hearing birds outside. It's a constant reminder of our connection to nature. We're bringing that, and we want to put it here in a really innovative, exciting exhibit to get people excited about not just migration, but birds more generally. So we're really excited about this. The groundbreaking is 2017. Hopefully will be completed in 2019. We're planning all the exhibits now, and we're in a major fundraising campaign to get this thing, make it reality. We're very excited about this. But it's that even though these birds can be common, you can see them every day, and we get used to them. Birds are also some of the most exciting animals out there. They occur everywhere across the globe. They have almost every color you can imagine that make up their feathers. They have these incredible vocalizations, one of which you'll hear in a little bit from the sage grouse, that are just remarkable. And vocalizations that they make from their syrinx, and vocalizations they make from their wings, from their tails. They occur at elevations as high as Mount Everest to as low as the Amazon rainforest. Birds are remarkable. They are spectacular. That's why it's important that we protect them, and we monitor them, and we keep them for not just our children, but our children's children. Most of you probably are aware that 2014 was the anniversary of the extinction of the passenger pigeon, and we sort of celebrated this in a lot of different ways. Not celebrated in a happy way, but celebrated it in more of a somber way, in that we don't want to forget what happened with the passenger pigeon. It was thought to be the most abundant bird in the Americas in the 1800s. In 1860, there was one flock that was estimated to be about 3 billion birds. Somebody, an observer, said they saw this flock start in the morning and continue throughout the day across the entire sky. There's a flowing river in the sky. And what happened was, from 1860 and 1880 to 1914, when the species went extinct, it went from billions to none in a single person's lifetime. And what I'm going to tell you today is, we're seeing that same thing today. Back then, in the 1880s, 1914, we really didn't know what was happening. We didn't have regulations. We didn't have monitoring. We were in the Civil War. There was a real desire and a need for protein that wasn't easily accessible. There were a lot of conflicting and converging events that were really driving the extinction of the passenger pigeon. It was considered a pest. Even today, when I hear about crows that are swarming near roost sites, people are complaining about the poop that are getting on their cars. Well, the numbers of animals that I've read about with the passenger pigeon far exceed anything you could ever imagine with a crow. And at this time, people were thinking about this as a pest, except people don't eat crow. At least I try not to eat crow. Back then, people ate passenger pigeon. In fact, I've found several recipes for passenger pigeon that were usually served with chestnuts, American chestnuts. And then it happened. Martha, the last passenger pigeon, was brought into captivity for several years. They tried to get it to reproduce in captivity, and they couldn't do it, and it died. It died at the Cincinnati Zoo on September 1st, 1914. It now is in the Museum of Natural History, in our drawers, and it is now considered as sort of the symbol for the threat of extinction and something to never forget. And that's why we spent so much time this past year playing this up, putting a display up in the Natural History Museum, talking about this all over the country, creating a film about this. We've done all sorts of things to make sure that people are aware of this threat of extinction. But I'm here to tell you that the passenger pigeon wasn't the last species to go extinct. There have been several others. For example, the Carolina parakeet. This species was last seen in 1918, also a live animal at the Cincinnati Zoo. Died 2 years or 4 years after Martha. I don't think it was a very happy time at the Cincinnati Zoo. They had 2 species go extinct in their very hands. Nothing that they've done, but in the case of the Carolina parakeet, it was probably massive deforestation that happened in the southeastern United States that ultimately caused the extinction of the Carolina parakeet. Eskimo curlew, a wonderful shorebird, not on the endangered species yet, endangered species list yet, but the last known bird here was seen in 1963, last confirmed sighting. This species was hunted. This species' habitat was probably destroyed along the Rockies and a lot of the prairies that it needed to feed on various types of Rocky Mountain grasshoppers and other species of grasshoppers. So habitat destruction and over-harvesting were probably responsible for that species. The Bachman's warbler, again, not officially listed as an extinct species yet, but the last known bird was seen in South Carolina in 1977. Small warbler species that we think wintered in Cuba, but again, probably habitat destruction. Probably not in Cuba, probably actually in the United States, just like with the Eskimo curlew that caused its demise. Finally, a Hawaiian species, the po'uli. Last known bird was seen in 2004. The thing that's so distressing about this one, this bird was only discovered in 1973, and then in 2004, it went extinct. Now, I don't want to be depressing all night. What I want to emphasize is that there's things that we need to be aware of, but we need to be optimistic, and we need to recognize where we've been successful. And what I want to emphasize is that when we put conservation to action, conservation works. We know the recipe. There's no surprises here. We know the recipe. In some cases, we have research to do, and we have to do that research, but we are at the point now where we can do these things. It takes resources, it takes knowledge, it takes momentum. But we can do that. Conservation works. This is the Kirtland's warbler, spectacular species. I work on this bird. I do all kinds of things with this species. This is a bird that breeds. It's a highly specialized warbler that breeds in the jack pine forests of the lower peninsula of Michigan. It's since spread as its populations have expanded. It was down to about 200 individual birds in the 1970s. 200. That is nothing. 200 birds. People started to get alarmed. They didn't even really know where it wintered. They figured it was somewhere in the Caribbean, but they weren't sure. Again, it's a long-distance migratory bird, so it spends the majority of the annual cycle on the non-breeding grounds. But they started to look at this bird, and they realized that, well, there are a lot of cowbird eggs in the nests of these birds. And so these Kirtland's warblers became the parents of cowbirds because cowbirds are nest parasites. They lay their eggs in the nests of other species. So cowbirds that naturally expanded across the U.S. because they were naturally in the West, but they expanded across the U.S. because of deforestation and the expansion of grazing and pastures, were laying eggs in Kirtland's warblers' nests. But there was also a lot of habitat destruction going on in these areas. Jack pine happens to be a fire-dependent species, and there was a lot of fire retention going on, so the habitat was changing in ways that was not suitable for the Kirtland's warblers. So once people went in there and started managing these habitats, which is essential, they managed the cowbirds, they managed the habitats, I'm happy to say that we're up to 1,700 singing males, about 3,400 birds now, because we recognized what the problems were, we put management into action, and now we're working on the species to try to get their numbers up even higher. California condor. The last known individual in the wild was in 1987. They were brought into captivity, put into a captive breeding program, and now we're up to over 100 individuals that have been put back into the wild. So this is another success story. These species were thought to sort of reach their demise because of lead shot, because hunters want to use lead for some reason. I'm a hunter, but I don't need to use lead. There's no reason to use lead. And also to habitat destruction. These are the primary, and DDT was another big problem for the California condor. The bald eagle, another species. Could you imagine having to tell your kids about this bird that once flew across the U.S., that was about this big, his head was bright and white, spectacular. Oh, by the way, it's our national symbol, it's our national bird, but it's no longer with us because we screwed up because we were using a pesticide known as DDT, and we didn't catch it in time. But you know what? We did catch it in time. We found out the DDT was doing some unintended things. We got rid of DDT, and then the peregrine falcon, the bald eagle, the brown pelican, and a whole suite of other species came back because we put conservation to work, and it came back and it responded. Now bald eagles are quite common. You can go to some places not too far from here, and you can see 20 bald eagles perched in trees along the Potomac River. That's a spectacular sight. So not only are birds important for us aesthetically, they tell us, they remind us about our connection to nature, there are more practical reasons to protect birds. They're sort of the premier canaries in the coal mine, if you will. They're superb indicators of environmental health. If birds are present, usually the environment's pretty good. If there are contaminants there, something's not good, there's lead, or there's climate change going on, because we know so much about birds, because they're integral parts of the ecosystems, and they incorporate things from the food web into their tissues, into their bodies, into their young. They are these fantastic organisms, and we know them so well. We understand birds better than we know any other organism, I would argue, and I think I've got lots of support for that. And because of that, they provide these wonderful indicators of the ecosystem. And when you can say that the bird habitat's healthy, you can probably be pretty certain that it's going to equal economic well-being. The two things go hand in hand. And there's also a long history of monitoring. As I described that 50-year data set, there are other data sets like that that go on even longer. So we can look at how birds have responded to things like land use change, climate change, or other factors in the environment. West Nile virus is one way I've used these data to look at how West Nile virus, which impacts humans, also has impacted birds. So it's in that sort of spirit that groups from all over the United States and Canada and Central and South America, Caribbean, came together to do something we call the state of the birds, a full analysis of as many species as we possibly could across the entire United States. And I reported back on this in the castle in a public press conference about what the state of the birds in the United States actually is. And I'm going to sort of fill you in a little bit on that today. You can see the Smithsonian here. It's with groups like USGS, Nature Conservancy, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Both governmental, federal, and non-federal organizations came together in a highly cooperative way to do that. So I'll tell you a little bit about the methodologies. We use two different indices to assess the state of the birds, to look at this, to analyze the data, the monitoring data. We use birds as indicators of sort of America's great habitats. We took a habitat like grasslands, and we looked at, say, the top 15 birds that we would consider specialists in grasslands, and looked at their trends over time. And we did this with several habitats. And we used several long-term types of data. And then there are other groups that aren't necessarily found in specific habitats and actually are not monitored. There are several species out there, quite a few, that are not monitored. So we use several different indices to assess their condition, the state of their populations. And we consider this a watch list approach. So I'll talk to you about both of these as we cover most of these different species. I apologize for the quality of the slide here. This, if you could see that all these yellowish mustard color lines are these breeding bird survey routes all over the country. This is that program started by Chan Robbins in the 1960s. So this is one of our data sets. We also use Christmas bird count data, data that's collected by citizens across the United States, now actually throughout the Western Hemisphere, around Christmas time. And we use these data. These data go back almost 100 years, a data set that's monitored and kept by the National Audubon Society. We used waterfowl surveys and several different types of surveys that were started in 1974 that collected data on shorebirds. The habitats that we focused on for the indicator part of this project were arid lands, coastal habitats, eastern forest, grasslands, inland wetlands, western forests, and then the whites, all other habitats. So let's look at some of the data, some of the results. These are for these 5 habitat types. And you'll see the data are suggesting birds are going in a variety of different directions. If the line is on this dotted line, that means the populations have been stable since about 1968 to 2014. And what you'll see that birds in wetlands are actually doing okay. They're actually increasing. That's a success story. All other groups of birds are not doing so well. All of the birds since 1968 have generally declined, whether they're from western forests, eastern forests, arid lands, or grasslands. They're generally in a pretty serious decline. Wetland birds are showing, on average, across all the indicator species, increases of up to 37% since 1968. That's great news. That's species like the anhinga, or the snake darter, and the gadwall, which populations are up by over 200% since 1968. Grassland birds have declined by 40% since 1968. That means almost 1 out of every two birds in a grassland habitat is no longer there. There are some, though, that have stabilized. Upland sandpiper has increased by 30%. Sharp-tailed grouse up by 14%. But there are other grassland species that are in steep declines, in fact, by over 75%. That means every 3 out of 4 birds in these habitats since 1968 is no longer there. Those are massive declines. Sprague's pipit, eastern meadowlark, the bobolink. So what we're seeing is that over this time frame, a time frame that's not that different than the passenger pigeon, we're seeing similar sorts of declines within a society where we know better. We know regulation. We know conservation works. But yet we're seeing the same things. What about in arid lands? On average, all populations of indicators have declined by over 46%. Species like the Bendire's thrasher has declined by over 85%. Scaled quail by over 75%. LeConte's thrasher by over 75%. Western forests, on average, have declined by over 18%. But there are these species that have shown really sharp, drastic declines. Lewis's woodpecker by over 60%. Pinyon jay, over 85% declines. And the rufous hummingbird, remarkable species, declined by over 60%. In eastern forests, it's a little worse. Across all indicator species, they've declined by over 32%. The wood thrush, the DC state bird in a lot of different states on the East Coast. Spectacular song. If you haven't heard it, really recommend you hear that beautiful flute-like song. They'll be here in mid-April, and they're actually right in Rock Creek Park, but their numbers are getting lower. Over 60% decline in the wood thrush. Cerulean warbler, over 75% decline. The whippoorwill, over 75% decline. And the golden-winged warbler, over 70% decline. All these species are actually long-distance migratory birds that spend the majority of the annual cycle in the tropics. What I'm going to tell you is that for most of these species, we don't know why they're declining. We don't have a DDT. We don't have an overharvesting issue at this point. These declines are a little bit more mysterious. Now, we can also look at coastal species. And in many cases, coastal species have responded positively. Just like with wetland birds, because of lots of duck hunting and a lot of refuge making, with coastal species, there's been a lot of habitat protection. And so we've seen the responses to these sorts of management. So we're seeing species like the common eider and the Harriman's gulls populations really increasing. But other species, like migratory shorebirds, have been declining rapidly. The red knot, for example, its populations have declined by over 95%. In fact, this species has just been listed on the threatened list just a few months ago. It's a species, perhaps you've heard, it actually stops over in the Delaware Bay in May. Its arrival is synchronized with the spawning of the horseshoe crabs, and they take advantage of these lipid-filled eggs that the horseshoe crabs lay, along with several other shorebird species that take advantage of this, and they fatten up. And that stopover is critical. It's this bottleneck that occurs. And these birds have to stop there on their way up to the Arctic to breed. It's one of the last stopovers that they have. But they've got this long flight that they have to make, and they just chow down on these eggs, and they fill up, and they fatten up, and then they get really big, and then they just take off, and they make that flight, but they burn that energy as they're migrating. And without that energy, they die. They just can't make that journey. In fact, this red knot story is a story that we're going to really highlight in the birdhouse through one of our shorebird exhibits. It's a really exciting story, that synchronization that's occurred with the whole horseshoe crab phenomenon. But it's not the only shorebird that's declining. We're seeing a lot of shorebirds, both from the Atlantic coast and the west coast, that have declined. The lesser yellowlegs, more than 70% decline. So again, as I mentioned, there are a lot of species that we don't monitor. And so we just don't have a way, we haven't been doing it for whatever reason. Somebody hasn't just taken that baton and gone with it. But we have other ways to sort of assess the state of their populations. And we've put 230 species of about 750 species across the U.S. On this watch list. 95 of these are already listed as threatened or endangered. And when you look at this group, one of the things I want to point out, the red are the ones that are federally threatened or endangered. The yellow ones are the ones that we put on this watch list. Hawaiian forest birds, 100% of them are either federally threatened or endangered or on our watch list. And that's because Hawaii, our own state, a state in the United States, is actually what we consider the extinction capital of the world. We're seeing extinctions in our own lifetimes. We've seen several already. All 33 of the remaining native Hawaiian forest birds require some type of conservation action, either by listing or by habitat protection, and they soon might be listed anyway, or reproductive, captive reproduction. Species like the palila, the Kauai elapaio, the crested honeycreeper, these are remarkable species. They're just remarkable. And the Akea polau, I'm sure I mispronounced that, but I actually did a pretty good job. And the Hawaiian crow. This is a species that was taken into captivity. There were no individuals left breeding. They brought it into captivity. They've managed to breed them, and they're getting ready. They may have already done the release, but they're going to release them again to try to reintroduce their populations into the wild. But the Hawaii situation is a sad one. It is and they're threatened by a variety of things, everything from malaria to cats to rats. Oceanic and seabirds, again, this is another case. These species have faced several different challenges and threats, everything from the depletion of their prey due to overfishing, to oil spills, plastic pollution, and of course, climate change, and other impacts that hit them when they're on islands, these vulnerable periods of the annual cycle when they're exposed to different threats and their young are exposed. Species like the Laysan albatross, the black-footed albatross, ashy storm petrel, and the black skimmers. There are lots of other species that I would refer to as common species that are also on these watch lists. And shorebirds, species like the whimbrel, Hudsonian godwit, sanderling, black-cap petrel. They occur in every habitat. The Bicknell's thrush, a species that breeds in the high-altitude boreal forest and winters on the island of Dominican Republic. Massive amounts of deforestation going on in the Dominican Republic, but also climate change that's impacting these high-elevation habitats. The greater prairie chicken, and a species which is probably going to be the next species to go extinct in the U.S., the Gunnison sage grouse. And I'd like to play you a video of the Gunnison sage grouse. This is a species, imagine that you're in Gunnison, Colorado. Let's see if I can do this. You're in Gunnison, Colorado. It's late March, early April. It's pretty cold. I've dragged you out to this blind, and you're sitting in this blind thinking, what the hell did I do? It's really cold. And all of a sudden you hear this. And you look at me kind of strange, thinking, what did you do? And then the light starts to come up. That's the Gunnison sage grouse. That's a male. He's on a lek. A lek is an area where birds come to breed, to congregate. The males come to display, and the females come to then choose. This bird has this remarkable throat sac that he's using to make that sound. You also might imagine that this bird is also highly vulnerable right now because he's out there displaying, doing everything he can to attract a female while golden eagles are flying above, thinking, you know what, I think I'm going to have chicken today. Unfortunately, the sage grouse habitat, the sage itself, is under all sorts of threats, primarily grazing, but also exploration and habitat destruction due to oil exploration. And it's a very sad situation. The greater sage grouse, which also occupies areas just a little bit further to the north, is a species that's being considered for the Endangered Species Act in September. And we're actually going to be airing a film that's going to be coming out on Nature. We're going to hopefully do the premiere of this film at Natural History Museum in May, so keep your eyes peeled for that. This was produced by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, my very close friends there. Usually at one of these leks, only one or two males gets most of the pairings, most of the matings, the lucky guys. So that male will probably mate with one of those females multiple times in a day and over several weeks. And then the thing that I also find disturbing, the thing that sort of reminds me and makes me think about the passenger pigeon situation, is that there's lots of common birds, birds that I grew up chasing around, seeing all the time, that are now in steep decline. And our mantra has always been keeping these common birds common while we can. But still, there are 33 species that have lost more than 50% of their population size in the past 45 years. We're not quite at the 50, but we easily could be. Species like the eastern meadowlark, which I used to see all the time. They're hard to find now. The common nighthawk, where I grew up in Connecticut, in New Haven, you'd have them calling all over the rooftops. They're rarely in the rooftops in New Haven anymore. You don't see them very much at all. They're that uncommon. Bob white, pretty much gone from the eastern seaboard. Chimney swift, still around. You can see them coming into roost sites, especially during fall migration. In chimneys, they're pretty spectacular, but they're declining rapidly. And this guy, the rusty blackbird, a species that's declined by over 90% since 1968. And again, like with many of these species, the problem is, unlike with DDT, with bald eagles, and DDT with and over-harvesting with the passenger pigeon, we don't know why. We don't know why they're declining, and that's a bit of a problem. So I know I've sounded a little bit depressing, but the thing that I want to emphasize here is that there's nothing to be gained in pessimism. I firmly believe this, that the only way we can move forward is by being optimistic. I can be practical, but I can be optimistic. And I can say to myself that we know conservation works. The reason we saw the increases in so many duck species is because the hunters got it right. They figured out how to protect the resource that they really valued. We need to put habitat aside. And things like the North American Wetlands Conservation Act restored or enhanced over 20 million acres of really important habitat for ducks. And other species were protected along the way. We need to use that as an example. American oyster catchers were also declining until National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, put together something called the Atlantic Shorebird Conservation Business Strategy. They put economics behind protecting birds. They made it $1, something, they made these birds worth something that people could understand. And they put conservation action, they protected habitat. The American oyster catchers in the past 10 years have rebounded because they put management to action. There's hope for the sage grouse. The NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, has a sage grouse initiative. And they've enrolled lots of ranchers, 1,000 ranchers, to try to encourage sustainable grazing, this primary threat that's forcing this decision on the sage grouse in 11 different western states. Hopefully this will solve the problem. Many of us are actually not that optimistic about the sage grouse or the Gunnison sage grouse. The Endangered Species Act saved the California condor. We're hoping that proactive partnerships and other effective things that we've been developing over the past few years will help save species like the golden-winged warblers, species that have declined by over 70%. But we've got challenges. As I mentioned, it's not as simple as stopping DDT in the United States. We're dealing with habitat loss from things like urban sprawl. We're seeing massive amounts of urban sprawl, removing important breeding habitat for a lot of species. And we're also seeing tropical deforestation happening at alarming rates still. In Nicaragua and Guatemala, from some recent analyses we've just done, in the last 13 years, both of those countries have become deforested by over 25%. That's tremendous, and that's primarily due to palm oil development. So there's all kinds of threats. The biggest one, by far, is habitat destruction. This is not a good slide, but it's the best one I've got. The other thing that makes me very nervous is that we're not dealing, again, with a single thing like DDT, and it's not a single thing like habitat loss. You can't read this, but this is the mortality that we've calculated is due to cats on an annual basis. We estimate that over 2.4 billion birds of all different species are killed every year from both feral and outdoor cats. And it's not just cats. It's things like buildings and windows and even automobiles. Thankfully, our estimates show that things like wind turbines, when placed in proper places, actually have minimal impacts. So there's hope there. that we can manage these things. But there's certain things that we can deal with easily and other things that we can't deal with so easily. We need to prioritize like this to address these threats. So what are the lessons that we can take away from the passenger pigeon and from this talk that I've just given you? Knowledge is key. Monitoring and research, they're the foundations of doing all of this effective conservation. Doing research, doing science is essential for doing effective conservation. If you don't know what's limiting a population, if you don't know where these populations are and why they're declining, you can't do conservation. That requires science. That requires monitoring. And we have to continue to invest in this fundamental aspect of this. Habitat is by far, it's our legacy. We have a legacy of habitat protection through the national park systems, through refuges, through private lands, through the Department of Defense. Department of Defense actually protects tens of thousands of acres across the entire United States. This is really important. But the challenge now moving forward is taking this system and expanding it further into our neighbors that share our resources, share our birds, into the Caribbean, into Central America, into South America. And then we have to recognize the fact that we've learned a lesson from hunters. We need to manage these populations. We can't just let them go and assume that they're going to do okay. That's just not going to happen. For most of these species that are declined by 90%, it's going to take management. We're going to have to change. We've changed these habitats in many ways. They're going to continue changing due to climate change. We need to figure out how we can help most of these organisms that we depend on. That's going to be the challenge. But we can do it. So how do we avoid the next passenger pigeon? Well, 100 years after losing the passenger pigeon, I would argue that I think we have the tools to prevent extinction and keep common birds common. And I'm going to fight to put those tools in place. It's our choice. Ultimately, I'd say, junior, that's not a very good report card. It's mixed. I'd give it a C. There are some serious concerns across several habitats and with several species, and we need to get to work. We have to protect our investments in what we've done with our policies that we've created. We need to give them more teeth. We need to protect more habitats. With the habitats that we've protected, we need to make sure they're safe. We need to make sure there's no cats on them. We need to make sure that there's no damages and no challenges that are being created by those habitat protections. This is the moment for conservation. This is something that Tom Lovejoy said to me just a few weeks ago. This is the moment for conservation. Birds are the lever. I totally agree with that. It's exactly what we need to be saying. When we have the will to conserve, we can make a much better future, for not just for birds, but by doing it for birds, we do it for ourselves. This is essential. Thanks very much. I'd be happy to take some questions. Yeah.
Any thoughts on how you address the cat problem?
The cat problem is a very tricky one. It's hit ahead in Virginia right now. And what I can say is that my science keeps telling me that cats are a problem. And as a Smithsonian scientist, I have to continue to put out the word about the science, and that's what I'm continuing to do. That they do take a lot of birds every year. It's a controversial topic because it really boils down to whether we kill domestic species or we don't kill euthanize. And so it's an animal rights issue. But as I always say, I believe in animal rights, but I believe in wild animal rights, not necessarily just animal rights more broadly. I believe in wild animal rights, and that's what I'm here to protect. And I think cats are a real challenge. But it should be low-hanging fruit when we compare it to things like deforestation in the tropics. Yeah.
When we intervene to protect any species, how do we make sure that our intervention is not going to result in some unanticipated consequence down the road that might be negative? Can you predict in the future?
Yeah, it's hard to predict in the future like that, but I do know that when we've already intervened by unintentional intervention, by changing habitats, by doing what we're doing to climate, by introducing contaminants in the environment, by letting domesticated species roam free out in the wild, by removing those threats, it's probably going to do more good than any harm that we might do in the future. I'm not talking about rewilding and bringing back the woolly mammoth and letting that species like that go. I'm talking about, bringing things back that were once there. So I think that we can be safe and sleep comfortably by doing that, by removing current threats that weren't there at one time.
If we could wait for the microphone, because we are recording this and we have people who are watching live, we want to make sure they hear the question.
Hi.
Hi.
You mentioned with regard to some of the species that you weren't really sure why they appeared to be decreasing, but you also said that conservation works. At least in the cases of those species for which we are uncertain of the reason for the decline, what steps can we take and how could we be confident that they would work in those cases?
Very good question. So, for example, for the wood thrush, we just haven't done the research to try to, we can't study every species. We're not even monitoring every species. So in the case of the wood thrush, what we're doing is that we're doing a retrospective analysis. We're looking at their trends over time at a finer spatial scale, and we're looking at how habitat change has happened in each of these smaller units to see how that corresponds to population change. And we're doing that with climate, we're doing that with habitat, with sort of the leading hypotheses to try to understand whether it's habitat change here on the breeding grounds, habitat change on the wintering grounds, and where specifically that might be happening, to see if we can at least look at those two primary drivers, see if they're influencing things. And I would propose that we do that for a lot of these species, like the rusty blackbird, like the golden-winged warblers, like the eastern meadowlark. Because it could be other things. It could be, we know the wood thrush was actually impacted by eggshell thinning due to acid deposition for a while there. At least that was one hypothesis. So there are a variety of things that could be influencing these populations, and we're now really starting to tackle or make attempts to try to figure out what is going on. But we're at that leading edge. I really want to emphasize that.
Yes. Are you taking steps to educate the public about the statutes and the rules that are in place? For example, the House is now considering the Wetlands Protection Rule. And what are you doing to help the public understand the importance of the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, and other statutes and rules that have an impact on birds?
So that's a very good question. And I'll give a talk like this, but I'm a scientist. And my role in the Smithsonian is really to provide the best science I can possibly provide to report on their trends and what's causing these declines. My role is not to speak to policies themselves. There are groups out there like the American Bird Conservancy, the National Audubon Society, Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and other NGOs, larger NGOs, WWF, CI, that report and bring up these policy actions that can be put in place.
Two quick questions. One, could you talk about the importance of bird building collisions relative to other threats? And the second is, what can individuals do besides keeping cats inside and drinking bird-friendly coffee?
Thank you very much. It's good. I didn't pose that question. That's a very good question. So bird buildings and collisions with towers are the second biggest threat, but they pale in comparison to cats. So they are second. And there's some great groups in D.C., like D.C. Lights Out, and there's groups across the country that are encouraging lights to be put out in these buildings. But I still keep seeing these glass buildings that are going up all over the place. It just kills me, these pure glass buildings. And birds just can't see, and they just go right through that, they just hit those buildings and die. So it's unfortunate, but the encouraging news is that some corporations, places in Chicago like McCormick Place, they're turning their lights out at night. So it both saves energy and it saves birds. There's lots of things you can do as homeowners, as citizens, to protect birds, including, telling your neighbors to keep their cats in, because I'm sure all of you guys keep your cats indoors already if you have cats. You can plant native plants. Native plants are really important because they provide food for birds and other organisms. Native plants have these co-evolved systems with many insects that form the basis for a lot of the food webs that are so important in these urban-suburban environments. Get rid of your grass. Put in more shrubbery and habitats to encourage nesting. These are all really important things you can do. Don't use contaminants. Don't use pesticides. Don't use herbicides. All these things impact wildlife in your environment. Put out nest boxes. Put out water. I put a pond in my yard. I can't believe the species that I've seen in my pond for the past 3 years that have just come for water while they're migrating through this very dry area, and they just stop and they take water. Things like cerulean warblers and palm warblers, they'll stop and get water right there. Nesting cover. Here's another one. Drink Smithsonian bird-friendly wine. This is something else we're actually working on. In fact, in another week, I'll be going to Napa Valley. There are several, I'm going to sacrifice, several vintners out there are very excited about looking into developing a certified Smithsonian bird-friendly wine. And we can do the same thing with rice. We can do this, we've done it with coffee. We can do it with chocolate. There are lots of ways, and it's not Rainforest Alliance. There's issues with Rainforest Alliance. Ours is science-based. It's science-certified. You can be sure when you drink a nice hot cup of bird-friendly coffee, it's got 40% shade. 100% of those beans have 40% shade. It's organic. 80% of them are actually, the beans are fair trade. And we can do the same thing with several other products. And this is something I really want to promote, to bring our science to the marketplace so people like you all can make these decisions on a daily basis. And all this is going to be highlighted in the birdhouse, in the new birdhouse with experienced migration. Yeah.
I don't have, my name is Richard Collins. I don't have a question so much as two observations that I would like to make. It was my great good fortune to work for Dan Inouye, who was a senator from Hawaii for 52 years. He was very concerned about the loss of habitat in Hawaii. And on the theme of things aren't always as they seem, we used to earmark funds in the Defense Appropriations Bill for the brown tree snake because it threatened the crow population in Guam, and these things would crawl into the wheel wells of aircraft coming out of the air bases in Guam and fly to Hawaii. And it was a predator that the Hawaiian birds had no defense against. So that's one observation about things not being what they seem at all times. Sometimes earmarkings were good. And the second thing is that people should be aware that these base closure and realignment actions, where you take a military installation out of the federal government's control, you're losing potentially a very vast area of conservation-controlled land. One of the threatened or endangered species was, and you could help me with this, it's a red-headed woodpecker down in North Carolina.
Red cockaded woodpecker, yeah.
Red cockaded woodpecker. Fort Bragg, North Carolina, is one of the best habitats for that bird.
Yeah.
And if it goes on to a base closure commission report and it gets closed, we have to be very careful that whatever agreements that are signed incorporate conservation measures to protect these species.
I agree 100% with everything you've just said. The brown tree snake is just a catastrophe. And when they got to Guam, they created, all havoc. And it was just until just recently that somebody figured out how to actually kill them with Tylenol implanted in small little frozen pinky mice. And I don't know what the current status is now, but I think it's had a big impact on the brown tree snake population in Guam. And I think I said during my talk, the Department of Defense maintains massive amounts of land across the United States and also funds enormous amounts of research on their lands. I've been the recipient. I've got 2 Department of Defense grants right now for doing research on their properties, on their different defense installations, not just here, but internationally. And they fund international work because they now recognize, part because I've convinced them, that they can't just manage these birds that are on their property for 3 months of the year. These birds may be spending the rest of the year in Cuba. So, I love that. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering about the habitats of the birds that are in the Great Lakes area. What's happening with them? Are they declining, or like areas such as Horicon Marsh? Or they come in and they nest or breed and then they go on,
Yeah, I'm not aware of what's going on with the habitats. The Great Lakes themselves are, unfortunately, a real dynamic place that have changed drastically. Everything due to introduced species, to climate change. But birds around the Great Lakes themselves, I'm not familiar with anything that's happening there in particular. We've just finished and published a very large climate change report, which was it was the first full annual cycle climate vulnerability analysis that's ever been done for the Great Lakes, the upper Midwest Great Lakes region. And there are a few species there, like common terns and other species that are more water dependent around the Great Lakes that are in trouble, not just for things happening there, but also things happening on their wintering grounds. Yeah.
How do we deal with the very famous quote of, in the end, we conserve only what we love, we will love only what we understand? When it comes to action for birds, what are we doing to increase the awareness and knowledge and beauty and majesty of birds versus other animals? So if I have a cat that I want to let out at night, but I just think, well, there are birds out there. It doesn't bother me. They're just birds.
Yeah.
How do we change? How do we educate? How do we see the majesty and the diversity of birds in a way in which people begin to rethink what birds are and the important role that they play?
Thanks, Bob. So I think I ask myself that question every morning when I wake up. And for me, it's about reaching as many people as I can with as intimate an experience with birds as I possibly can. And that's one of the things I'm really excited about being at the National Zoo, actually, because we have 2.5 million people that go through our gates every day or every year. And not only that, I can do my science, but I have the opportunity to reach the general public through these exciting exhibits like Experience Migration, which I've spent the last 5 years working on. I'll probably spend the next 5 years working on as well with this incredible team of people. But that's going to be an opportunity to do what my ultimate goal is, which is what you just said, which is to flip a switch. I want to flip a switch for somebody, like my switch was flipped when I was 6 years old at the Westport Nature Center in Connecticut, when a guy by the name of Bob Dwyer, a naturalist, showed me a bird in the hand. It was a black-capped chickadee. And for whatever reason, what you just described, the beauty, the excitement, the interest of this interesting animal, for some reason, at that point, for whatever reason, ever since then, I've been totally passionate about birds. And what I want to do is help as many people as I can find their passion. And whether they know it or not, it's going to be birds. Yeah.
Could you speak to the ivory-billed woodpecker? It wasn't endangered or extinct, so...
It's still not extinct, but it's probably not there. The ivory-billed woodpecker situation, I'm not sure what exactly happened there, but it's probably not actually occurring in the wild anymore. There's probably no more ivory-billed woodpeckers out there anywhere. That would be my gut on the whole situation. It was an unfortunate circumstance. A lot of things. I totally respect and love the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They're my close colleagues. Fitz is a very good friend, as well as a lot of people that were involved in that situation. And they were doing what they just thought was the thing to do. They were very excited about something that somebody saw, and they were reputable, and they followed up on it in the way they should have from a conservation perspective. And we all think they got it wrong, but that's okay. Before you leave, I do have, if you're interested, don't take them unless you're interested, but I brought State of the Birds reports. I don't know if I have enough for everybody, but if you'd like to take one, you can read some of the more details of the report and what went into it, if you're interested. But thanks for coming out tonight, and you can contact me if you have other questions, and visit our website, Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. Thanks very much.
I just wanted to let everybody know that we do have coffee and biscotti to take out with you. Thank you, Peter, so much for coming tonight. This was really great. I learned a lot. It's amazing every time I come to one of these events that we organize. I walk home at night and I learn more and more about Smithsonian and what we do, so it's pretty exciting. Thank you for hosting us tonight, National Zoological Park. And thank you for coming tonight, and stay warm on your way home.